When a routine traffic stop turns into a career-defining moment, a police officer's worst assumptions collide with a truth he never saw coming. The man he pulls over isn't just another driver. He's holding the keys to his future. The sun dipped low over the streets of Raleigh, streaking the sky with hues of burnt orange and soft lavender. Daniel Whitman was heading home after a grueling day, filled with meetings and emails. His silver crossover glided quietly along the avenue as he adjusted the vents, hoping to wash away the tension clinging to him. A mellow jazz tune drifted from the speakers, barely audible above the hum of passing cars. As he neared an intersection, the traffic signal switched from amber to red, and Daniel coasted to a halt. That's when the sudden flash of sirens and flashing lights shattered the calm. Glancing at his mirror, he sighed and steered to the shoulder, lowering his window as a patrol SUV eased in behind him. Out stepped Officer Colton Hayes, early 40s, squared jaw, and a no-nonsense walk. His uniform was crisp, and his every movement spoke of routine authority. "License and registration," Hayes said flatly, his tone professional but clipped. Daniel handed them over without protest, retrieving the documents with steady hands. Though composed, he couldn't help but notice Hayes's sharp, assessing gaze, like he was looking for something more than expired tags. "Do you know why I stopped you?" the officer asked, leaning slightly into the window frame. "Not really," Daniel answered calmly, his voice level but respectful. "You didn't fully stop before the light," Hayes replied after a brief pause, the doubt in his voice subtle but present. Daniel furrowed his brow, then nodded once. "I thought I braked in time, but I understand." Hayes didn't walk away. Instead, he lingered by the car, his eyes narrowing, expression tightening. What had started as procedural was morphing into something else entirely. His posture changed, shoulders tenser, stance more assertive, as if the moment demanded more scrutiny. He glanced again at the license. "You new around here?" he asked. Daniel hesitated. "Just a beat. I relocated a few months ago. The address is up to date." But Hayes wasn't really focused on the answer anymore. His questions were veering off script, taking on a sharpness that hinted at something deeper than a red light violation. Caleb's composed manner seemed to give Officer Hayes pause, and he leaned in just a little more. "Where were you headed in such a rush?" "Just going home," Caleb responded evenly. His voice was calm, but the shift in energy between them was impossible to miss. Hayes wasn't looking at a commuter anymore. He was looking at someone who didn't fit into whatever narrative he'd constructed. Caleb felt the weight of the moment settling over them, but he remained unshaken. What the officer couldn't see was that his composure wasn't ignorance, it was restraint. And this was only the start. Hayes took a step back, folding the license and registration slowly and deliberately before slipping them into his uniform pocket. His posture straightened, and a trace of smugness crept into his expression, as if he'd already drawn conclusions about the man before him. "Step out of the vehicle for me," Hayes said. Caleb's fingers tightened briefly around the steering wheel, but his expression remained unreadable. "May I ask why, officer?" His voice was steady, respectful. Hayes's mouth twitched, but he quickly concealed it. "I'm asking you to exit the vehicle. Let's not turn this into something more than it needs to be." The warning was clear, wrapped in a polite tone that barely masked its edge. Caleb let out a slow breath and opened the door. As he stood, Hayes's eyes scanned him with calculated precision. Caleb was slightly taller, his frame solid beneath the tailored navy blazer. His attire spoke of intention, every detail sharp and clean. But to Hayes, none of that seemed relevant. He motioned toward the front of the car. "Hands where I can see them." Caleb obeyed, moving with a controlled grace. "Is there something specific you're searching for, officer?" he asked. Hayes offered a tight smirk. "Routine check. There's been some trouble in the area. Can't be too cautious." Caleb turned his head slightly, his gaze steady as he met Hayes's eyes. "Trouble caused by men in suits driving clean sedans? Or is there another reason for this stop?" The question struck like a spark, and Hayes's confidence wavered just for a second. He shifted, his hand hovering near his utility belt, not out of need but reflex. "Watch your mouth," he warned, his tone sharpening. "I'm just asking a reasonable question," Caleb replied. There was no defiance in Caleb's voice, only a quiet conviction that made Officer Hayes uneasy. Hayes leaned in again, squinting. "You seem to know the drill a little too well. Got something you're not telling me?" Caleb let a beat of silence hang in the air before answering. "No, officer. I just think it's important to understand the basis of any official encounter. Clarity builds trust, doesn't it?" Hayes gave a dismissive snort, but didn't respond. He took a few slow steps in front of the vehicle, his boots scuffing lightly against the pavement. The balance of power was shifting in subtle ways, and Hayes could feel it slipping. Caleb wasn't acting like most people in that situation. No anxiety, no excuses, no darting eyes. What he saw instead was composure, a measured calm that disturbed the rhythm Hayes had come to expect. "You're mighty self-assured," Hayes muttered under his breath, almost as if speaking to himself. "Like you've already figured out how this is going to go." Caleb didn't bite. He tilted his head slightly and replied, "Confidence isn't the point, officer. It's about mutual respect." Hayes stiffened, caught off guard by the comment. Whatever smugness had lingered on his face disappeared, replaced by something tighter, more guarded. He looked like a man suddenly aware that he wasn't steering the interaction anymore. The silence stretched long enough to buzz beneath the skin. Hayes didn't like how this was unfolding, so instead of retreating, he pushed forward. Harder. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the edge of his holster, tension bleeding through every movement. He wasn't accustomed to being challenged, least of all by someone like Caleb. His eyes darted toward the vehicle, searching for any excuse, any justification to escalate. "Turn around and put your hands on the hood," Hayes ordered, his voice clipped and forceful. "I need to check for anything you might be carrying." Caleb arched a brow. "Anything I might be carrying," he echoed, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. "Do I honestly look like someone concealing a weapon?" Hayes clenched his jaw, and the mask of composure cracked for just a second. "I'm not going to repeat myself." Caleb paused, a flicker of unreadable emotion flashing in his eyes. Then, without resistance, he turned slowly and pressed his hands flat against the hood. Hayes stepped in, his boots crunching on the pavement like the sound of a fuse being lit in silence. The officer ran his hands over Caleb with brisk, forceful motions, each movement a little too aggressive, his touch lingering just long enough to send a message. This wasn't a standard pat-down. It was a performance, an assertion of dominance meant to provoke discomfort or fear. But Caleb didn't budge. He didn't flinch, didn't tense up, didn't give the officer the reaction he was fishing for. "You're clear," Hayes muttered, stepping back. The words came out grudgingly, as if disappointed he hadn't uncovered something that would validate his suspicion. Caleb turned slowly, meeting his eyes. His face remained composed, but his gaze was sharp as a blade. "Of course I am," he said quietly. "Now, if you're finished—" "I'm not finished," Hayes snapped, cutting him off. His voice rose just enough to betray the pressure building inside him. The words spilled out too fast, revealing his growing need to reassert control. "You seem real familiar with procedure. Want to tell me why that is?" Caleb crossed his arms loosely, unbothered by the edge in Hayes' tone. "Let's just say I've had a few encounters over the years. Learned a thing or two." Hayes squinted. "That right? What are you, a lawyer or something?" Caleb gave a small smile. "Something like that." The vagueness of the reply only seemed to irk Hayes more. He took a step forward, closing the space between them, his voice dipping low, almost a growl. "You think you're slick? Think you can out-talk me, spin this in your favor?" Caleb met his stare without blinking. "I'm not trying to do anything, officer. I just believe in fairness. And from where I'm standing, I haven't seen much of it today." The statement landed like a challenge, and Hayes rose to it instantly. "Fairness? You think that's what this is about? Guys like you always—" He caught himself mid-sentence, biting down on the rest, but the damage was done. The weight of the unfinished thought hung heavy between them. Caleb didn't move, but something in his stance shifted, just slightly, enough to let Hayes know the implication hadn't gone unnoticed. "Guys like me," Caleb repeated softly, his voice calm but laced with meaning. Hayes stiffened, pulling back as if suddenly aware he'd crossed a boundary he couldn't retreat from. "You know what I meant," he muttered, but the certainty in his voice had drained away. "I think I do," Caleb answered, his tone even. But the edge in his words wasn't mild anymore. It was cutting, exposing every unspoken truth Hayes had tried and failed to suppress. "And I think we both know this stopped being about a traffic stop quite a while ago." Hayes parted his lips to reply, but nothing came out. For the first time, his composure wavered, like the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he thought. The balance had shifted. He wasn't leading this exchange anymore, but the real reckoning was still on its way, and it would be one he'd never forget. Caleb broke the silence, his voice steady and resolute. "Officer, I think it's time you understood who I am." Hayes's brow furrowed, irritation flaring again. "I don't give a damn who you are," he snapped, though the strain in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Caleb slowly reached into his inside pocket, making sure his movements were calm and precise. "I'm reaching for my credentials," he said, keeping his eyes on Hayes, who instinctively tensed, his hand drifting near his weapon. "No drama necessary. I just want you to take a look." The air around them thickened with tension. Hayes watched intently as Caleb retrieved a leather badge holder and flipped it open. Inside, polished and unmistakable, was a federal badge. "Caleb Monroe," he said evenly. "Division Chief, Internal Affairs, North Carolina Bureau." Hayes went still. His eyes flicked between the badge and Caleb's face, desperate to find a trace of sarcasm or some clue that this was all an elaborate setup. But Caleb's expression held no humor, only calm authority, edged with restrained disappointment. "Internal Affairs?" Hayes echoed, his voice thinner now. "That's right," Caleb said, cutting him off. "I lead the unit responsible for evaluating officer conduct. It's my job to make sure that this badge is worn by people who actually honor what it's supposed to stand for." Hayes's skin lost a shade of color, and the confident edge he'd clung to crumbled. He instinctively took a step back, his hand falling away from his belt, as though the badge on his own chest had suddenly become too heavy to carry. Caleb stepped forward, his voice lowering, but gaining weight. "Do you want to know what's been most concerning about this whole interaction, Officer Hayes?" he asked, his tone clear and firm. Hayes didn't respond. He looked like a man who'd just realized he was standing in quicksand, and it was already up to his knees. "It's not the profiling," Caleb continued, "though that alone is disturbing. It's not even the unnecessary escalation. It's the fact that you did all of this without ever stopping to consider who you were dealing with. You assumed I wouldn't know my rights, that I'd be unaware of the very laws you swore to uphold. And why is that?" Hayes opened his mouth, but the words caught somewhere between his thoughts and his throat. Caleb's stare didn't waver. "Because I don't match your image of someone worthy of basic respect?" he finished for him. The words weren't shouted, but they struck like a verdict, calm and exacting. "And that's not just my issue, Officer Hayes. That's a liability for every single person you interact with in that uniform." Hayes's shoulders slumped slightly under the weight of the truth now pressing down on him. His gaze dropped once again to Caleb's badge, as if avoiding it would somehow undo what had just happened. Caleb took a measured step back, giving Hayes a breath of space, but his voice remained razor-sharp. "Here's what's going to happen," he said firmly. "You're going to take a step back, return my identification, and think very carefully before you speak again." Hayes's mouth twitched, caught between defiance and defeat, but he said nothing. The silence stretched just long enough before Caleb added, his voice dropping an octave. "And understand this. You'll be hearing from me again, not as someone you pulled over, but as the official who determines whether you should still have the authority you tried to misuse tonight." Hayes's complexion flushed, and his jaw tightened. Slowly, with unsteady fingers, he reached into his pocket and retrieved Caleb's license and registration, handing them over without a word. Caleb accepted them with quiet precision, tucking them back into his wallet. He walked calmly toward his vehicle, placing one hand on the door handle before pausing. He glanced back over his shoulder, his voice firm and final. "Let this stay with you, Officer Hayes. That badge you wear? It doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you responsible to everyone." As Caleb slid back into his vehicle and started the engine, Officer Hayes remained standing under the dimming sky, the last traces of daylight casting long shadows across the pavement. His confidence had fractured, and the certainty he once wore like armor now hung loosely on his shoulders. But for Caleb, the encounter wasn't the end. It was a beginning. What came next would send ripples through the entire department. The drive home was silent, but Caleb's thoughts churned. The confrontation echoed in his mind, not because it stood out, but precisely because it didn't. Hayes was far from the first officer he dealt with like that, and he knew, unfortunately, he wouldn't be the last. But this time, things were different. This time, he had both the perspective and the power to act. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds of Caleb's office at the North Carolina Bureau of Internal Affairs. He sat at his desk, a manila folder open in front of him. Officer Colton Hayes. The file painted a picture of subtle misconduct. Repeated complaints about his conduct during stops, vague accusations of aggressive behavior, questionable discretion, none of it ever escalated high enough to trigger action. Until now. Caleb leaned back, fingertips pressed together, eyes scanning the page with quiet intensity. Hayes wasn't an outlier. He was a product of something systemic. And Caleb had no intention of applying a temporary fix to something that demanded structural change. A knock on the door drew his attention. His assistant, Rachel, entered with a stack of folders balanced in her arms. "Good morning, Mr. Monroe. Here's the compiled summary for last month's internal reviews. Also, Director Vaughn asked me to remind you about the leadership audit next week." Caleb nodded, accepting the documents. "Thanks, Rachel. Also, please set up a meeting with Director Vaughn for later today. There's a matter I need to raise directly." She paused for a second, sensing the gravity behind his tone. "Absolutely," she said before stepping out. Caleb returned his focus to the folder, though his mind had already moved beyond it. This wasn't just about Hayes. It wasn't even about a single department. It was about the silent code that gave men like Hayes the confidence to operate unchecked. And if there was one thing Caleb understood clearly, it was this. The code began at the top, and that's where it had to be broken. Later that day, Caleb sat across from Director Vaughn in a quiet conference room. Vaughn, a seasoned professional with years of service etched into the lines of his face, leaned back as Caleb calmly recounted every detail of the traffic stop. "I could have treated it as just another unpleasant encounter," Caleb said, his voice calm but unwavering. "But ignoring it would have been the real mistake. Hayes's conduct isn't some rare exception. It's a symptom of how much work we still have ahead of us." Director Vaughn rubbed his temples, letting out a slow breath. "This isn't the first time Hayes has landed on our radar," he admitted. "But every time it's been handled quietly, behind closed doors." "And that's exactly the issue," Caleb replied. "Silence doesn't solve problems, it preserves them. It's time we stop being silent." Vaughn studied him, the gravity of the moment settling between them. "What are you suggesting?" "A comprehensive department audit," Caleb responded without missing a beat. "Not just looking at officers individually, but re-examining our training programs, accountability structures, internal policies, everything. We can't demand public trust if we're unwilling to hold ourselves accountable first." Vaughn leaned in, folding his hands on the table. "You realize this is going to shake things up?" "Good," Caleb answered. "It's long overdue." In the weeks that followed, the Bureau was swept into a storm of assessments, interviews, and community sessions. Caleb led from the front, gathering data, listening to concerns, and organizing town halls to give the public a voice. What began as one troubling encounter turned into a reckoning, a much-needed confrontation with institutional blind spots. Officer Hayes underwent a formal review. Caleb didn't conceal his involvement. He sat across from Hayes during the internal hearing, watching the man squirm under the weight of transparency. The board voted for a suspension, but Caleb understood that the true win wasn't disciplinary, it was preventive. Months later, Caleb stood at a podium in a packed civic center, addressing a room full of officers, city officials, and community leaders. He didn't speak of punishment or shame. He spoke of responsibility, shared, ongoing, and essential. His message wasn't about pointing fingers. It was about building something better. "Justice isn't just catching criminals," Caleb said, his voice echoing through the room. "It's making sure the people we entrust with power wield it with honor, fairness, and humility. That's the kind of badge I believe in, and the kind of badge we're committed to building together." The room erupted in applause, but Caleb didn't bask in it. For him, this wasn't closure. It was a call to action. As he stepped off the stage, he scanned the crowd. Some faces wore doubt, others held cautious optimism, but they were all paying attention. Change wouldn't arrive overnight, but it had started, and for now, that was enough. If this story meant something to you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Let's have the conversations that matter, the ones that move us forward. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that push us, that inspire us, and that remind us what's possible when we stand up for what's right.